Listen. You stop it. You have what it takes to play games, buddy. Far away from our no longer remaining relative, we hoist our figurative lone sail to nudge ourselves away from home. A blanket of ash befalls the sky, staking its claim on our loss. For time ticks not for us, and the fear of loneliness pierces our nerves like nails. Our courage comes not from the idea of venturing into the boundless, interminable wasteland before us, but from the warmth of both the hope of finding another human left in this world and the red coat that at least partially shields us from the inhospitable land and dreary skies. Surely our little buddy's simple expression of red, juxtaposed against the surrounding bleakness, speaks the state of the land on its own. Yes, Germany has dried up the oceans, but as long as we find a hidden community, food, or anything to keep us alive until winter, we'll remain safe. This thought quickly subsides as I gaze upon the measly 3 fuel supplies aboard the ship. Will only 3 supplies be enough to traverse this dilapidated world? Will our ship hold itself together as we frantically manage the gas pedal, fuel intake, steam exhaust, and brake pedal? Or will the ship break down and strand us? Are we traveling for the minuscule chance of finding someone still out there? Is there anyone still alive at all? Hello? These questions antagonistically swirl in my mind, whilst my worries shift to the last fuel supply that I cast off into the energy converter. Luckily, I spot relief just when the energy empties, and after the quick pit stop, I press onward with a replenished yet ever-dwindling fuel supply. The fear begins to weigh me down like a ball and chain. Once the limited energy supply almost strands us yet again, the next pit stop provides a new stock of fuel. Little did I know, I had missed an entire stash of fuel on the road between pit stops, and before I knew it, I was waking up in such a mountain of fuel that I struggled to climb out of it.
What's the meaning of this shit?
I no longer have any worries, doubts, or fears. I know I can make it. I know I will make it because my ship's energy is constantly satiated from the copious supply thrown at me. Far lone sails lacks fear. Curiosity may drive us further along the dusty trail, but the gameplay lacks the fear to keep us engaged with and concentrated on proper resource management and multitasking. Why care about a resource-intensive journey across a desolate, abandoned wasteland if there's no threat of resource deprivation? You never put yourself in danger of becoming stranded. In a world that elicits nothing but loneliness and isolation, the fear should encourage a desperation to manage dwindling resources between abandoned structures or moments of relief. For example, the outposts that outfit our ship with new gear should mean more than just an upgrade. These locations should mark a new day, a new opportunity to stock the hooks inside the ship with fuel supplies and prepare for the next outing. The variety of locations throughout the game should both be moments of relief that you managed your resources correctly, and reminders to take a deep breath before venturing back into the wasteland. The foreboding impending fail state should haunt you for most of the game. A fail state behind proper resource management gameplay implies a permanence of the loneliness that we're trying to escape from. The fear of isolation becomes dread as we lose more and more resources with no clear goal in sight. Every new building, every desecrated town, any possible sign of life enhances the morbid curiosity and dare say desperation to check every corner and press onward for the minuscule chance of said life. In fact, exploration should have been the game. Not only should fuel supplies not be thrown at you like a Thanksgiving feast, but the fuel supplies should be optional discoveries like in puzzles and hidden caches, rather than placed along a single unmissable path. The fact that the path forward is blocked until you find the thing you're supposed to find is silly because you're never placing yourself in dangerous situations. If you don't properly scavenge for fuel before setting off into the unknown, then there should be consequences. Exploration also offers a great opportunity for environmental storytelling. Perhaps solving a puzzle or unlocking a hidden door with some key could, instead of holding fuel supplies, house an abandoned camp, some dried up village, or a dead person's attic. Not only are the fuel supplies now sparse and valuable by not existing in every location possible, but the environments show different families' or groups' struggles. Far also contains volatile barrels that explode when smacked into the energy converter. These barrels are a last resort. Yes, they do provide plenty of fuel, but at the cost of additional micromanagement to quench the flame and repair the ship. The exploding barrels' cost of benefit is certainly a welcome fuel type, but again, why would we ever consider using them? Instead of keeping the barrels as an emergency backup, we either throw them out the back or never pick them up. Far loan sales with proper resource management should encourage risk-reward decision-making. Instead of mindlessly venturing onward and restocking fuel every few seconds, I want to feel the need to turn abandoned places upside down to restock my dwindling fuel supplies. Instead of complacency and a mild interest in the occasional environmental storytelling, we can revel in powerful feelings like relief, anticipation, fear, and hope. I want the game to play with the idea of hope, and we do see glimpses of this through the existing environmental storytelling. I'm hopeful that the derelict towns spring forth a survivor at any moment. I'm especially hopeful when the static of the radio miraculously picks up music still broadcasted from radio towers. And yet, nothing comes of the hints of possible life, and rightfully so. But to Far Loan Sales' demise, I do not fear via the gameplay. I am not afraid of solitude and death because I cannot be stranded from a lack of fuel. The ship is a checklist routine rolling toward the inevitable, and that's difficult to sympathize with and immerse myself into. The game tries to be an adventure of loneliness, but doesn't have the fear-driven gameplay to back it up. When I gaze into my fuel supply, I want the absence to gaze back into me. And absence was what Alan saw when he finally finished writing this latest novel. Alan wasn't exactly happy with Far Loan Sales, even though it sold like hotcakes. He wanted something more raw. He began to write his next novel called Alan Wake that featured a more tangible darkness. No, that's too much, it's too much. Alan Wake mismanages fear as well, this time through cutscenes, looping sound effect tracks, and more cutscenes. There's just a lot of them, there's more. Much of the gameplay takes place in obscured environments composed of twisting shadows and polluted air known as the darkness. Whenever you enter one of these danger zones, it's quite clear that it's time to struggle against the Dark Army and book it as fast as you can through the harrowing storm to the respite of safety. However, nothing quite screams, "Hey, fear me, please," than a brief cutscene outlining enemies. And these cutscenes are present for the majority of encounters throughout the entire game. The moments where I had to listen and check my surroundings without any enemy cutscenes were the best gameplay moments in the game, yet they were few and far between. I remember the best moment was when I actually heard the footsteps of enemies behind me, and miraculously there was no accompanying cutscene. Sometimes enemies came around corners next to me where a cutscene would have ruined the moment. Sometimes glimpses of enemies are strategically placed to be spooky, like the apparition that fades from our view, and the one that walks past the window whilst we're inside an abandoned single-room house. Once, an enemy knocked over shelves as a sorta unnecessary but bad butt greeting. Heck, the game goes as far as to hide an enemy in a bathroom stall. Yes, please. Compare these great natural examples that don't take control away from the player against an encounter that swoops the camera back for a bunch of enemies to awkwardly pop into existence. Or even an encounter where the enemy music begins playing before I even know they're out there stalking me. Why does this cutscene last 5 seconds before I regain control? Surely the self-driving loader would be more impactful if I noticed it for myself. Loaders are not exactly quiet vehicles. Is there a reason the camera moves to a murder of crows that did not exist before now?
There's probably a cannery nearby.
What? Not only are the groups of enemies announced for most encounters, but the late game speedy enemies are intentionally too difficult to pin down, so the only reliable method to deal with them is simply to ignore them until their cutscene plays. What? The atmosphere and my patience certainly takes a hit from the constant cutscenes, but the ambience and tension inside the buildings lends a different story. I slowly but surely crept through a building because I heard creaks, footsteps, doors, and such ambience. Oh, that's where the enemies were, I guess. So it ends up that this ambience is simply a looping track, and once I figured that out, my disappointment was so thick you could cut it with a very, very sharp kitchen utensil. The looping sound effect track doesn't hint at enemy placements, number of enemies, or direction that they're coming from, so there's no reason to be cautiously fearful and pay close attention to your surroundings and audio cues. The spooky underwater breathing is another noticeable looped sound effect track. After some time, I noticed that this breathing sound effect is tied to the hidden caches throughout the game, which is cute, but I didn't come to that conclusion until halfway through the game, and I dare say lost potential is thicker than cuteness. I expected the whispering to be related to the darkness. Maybe the whispering could be tied to some rare elite enemy so it helps elicit fear from the player. The entire goal is to make it from one end to the other through a blanket of hostile and intense darkness with infinitely spawning enemies. Why not force the player to book it whilst also looking around and checking flanks for enemies? Why not implement a proper sound system that emits faint footsteps, rustling, whispering, anything to distinguish enemies and their possible locations? The darkness constantly chases and threatens us, but the atmosphere and tension loses almost all of its steam once the smoke and mirrors are revealed. I had no reason to fear the darkness because it flashed me with cutscenes whenever enemies popped into existence. Alan Wake took its beyond fantastic gameplay loop and dragged it through a forest of grime until I was screaming for the gameplay to finally be over so I could see the story to the end. So, with all of Alan Wake's problems holding it back from stardom, Alan took to the cabin in the lake to rewrite and properly integrate fear in both Far Lone Sails and his autobiography Alan Wake. Legend says you can still hear him typing down there to this day. And legend it is, because how else can he prove his own existence when he's permanently stuck underwater? The very notion defies all sensibility and realism. Alan is ultimately isolated because he's stuck with a different set of rules than anyone else. Coincidentally, Alan finds a beginner's guide, written about an isolated man and his collection of short games that experiment with sets of rules. Game design dictates whether or not a game set of rules is playable, and occasionally, a designer and his or her creativity may butt heads against playability. The developer of these short games, whom I will call Tingle, desired to experiment with virtually endless ideas and creative works, but also believes creativity cannot coexist with playability. For example, Tingle's game Escape from Whisper plays with some mysterious device called the Whisper Machine and defies the physics of death to perhaps convey a deeper meaning beyond the initial sacrifice. but you could argue it's a soft lock. The game has no build-up nor any purpose or explanation, and the open space and skybox is not presentable. The game is creative, but not very playable. The past was behind her experiments with backwards movement, where the surroundings are always changing. Walls may completely transform into hallways, and new text only forms when the player walks backwards. However, the player must constantly check where they're walking in an unreliable environment. The game is creative, but not very playable beyond the short demonstration. The great and lovely Descent experiments with realism. You're led into a jail cell and, well, the cell opens an hour later.
In Coda's original design, the doors stayed shut for a full hour before letting you go.
What? The act of nothing spread over an hour is certainly the dictionary definition of unplayable. The what I'll call internet cavern is a whole crap ton of notes that Tingle pretends are written by internet users, but are actually windows into Tingle's mind. The character study is fascinating, but the messages are highly concentrated, so the reading becomes tedious and gradually less playable. The house cleaning game is a quaint character study that focuses on a calm and soothing repetition and slowly acquainting oneself with the lead housekeeper. The game never ends, so eventually the lack of a goal reduces playability. Even then, the playability is gone once the dialogue loops. Perhaps the most fascinating game of all is the Idea Room. The Idea Room contains a bunch of experimental game ideas that never came to fruition. A game of only posters and concept art show as a loud, bodiless sound walking around confusing people. In a small room until you realize you can just walk through the walls. A series of lavish manuals come with the game, giving you incorrect instructions on how to play. Dusting your jewelry while you're filming an advertisement, walking around on set filming whatever you like. All of these game ideas are interesting on paper, but how playable would they be? They wouldn't be very playable, or at least not sustainably so beyond a proof of concept. These games could be expounded to make them playable, but the potential time and effort investment to make them playable grinds against what Tingle believes is his creative engine. Tingle thinks creativity cannot coexist with playability. Heck, even climbing to the Idea Room is unplayable because the stairs slow the player's speed down to a crawl. And yet, Tingle's games that are both creative and playable are lauded by those whom Tingle has shared his games with. Consequently, he shifts away from his creativity and fulfillment toward playability and validation. Tingle begins to fear creating. What Tingle actually wants to create won't spur the positive validation that he desires and craves, so he left himself with no motivation or ideas to experiment with. Ultimately, you should work on projects that you legitimately love the process of. Don't work on projects for fame, for validation, for the hope of growing into something much more to the world around you. How much does the success and potential future opportunities really mean to you if you follow through with the idea but hate the process? You'll fear creating. You'll fear the lack of validation. You'll fear investing time in learning and growing. Life is too short to work on projects you hate. It's too short to fear what you hate. Life is too short to haphazardly toss together pages in a novel when the novel can be both creative and readable. And that's why Alan Wake will stay in that cursed cabin until he rewrites his novels.